Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some voices just sound a certain way, and how we decide what those voices mean? Today we're diving into a fascinating study that tries to untangle the mystery of creaky voice. That raspy, low sound sometimes called vocal fry, the kind of voice that has been in the headlines a lot lately, especially when people talk about how young women speak. But is it really a woman thing, or is there more to it? This study asks a really big question. Why do we hear creaky voices the way we do? And what influences our judgments? For a long time, science and society thought of creaky voice as something men did. Think of older research and some acoustic studies that linked it to male speakers. But then something shifted. Around the early 2010s, public talk and some newer studies started suggesting that women were using creaky voice more. This created a puzzle. A sort of disconnect between what the science was showing acoustically and what people were saying they heard. So the researchers here wanted to figure out if this perceived shift really happened because of how we perceive voices, and if two main things were at play. First, whether we have social biases tied to the speaker's gender, and second, whether the actual sound pitch, or F0, affects how we hear creakiness. They wondered if seeing a face would make us hear a voice differently, or if the pitch of the voice itself was the main trick. To get to the bottom of this, they did a pretty cool experiment. They took recordings of voices and played them for people. But here is the neat part. They manipulated the voices, so they wouldn't sound clearly male or female. Then they paired these ambiguous voices with pictures of either a woman's face or a man's face. It's called a matched guise paradigm. And it is like a secret test to see if a visual cue like a face can change how we hear something, even if the sound itself is the same. They also played around with the pitch of the voices, making them higher or lower. They had 40 people listen to these different combinations and rate how creaky they thought the voices sounded on a scale from not creaky at all to super creaky. And what did they find? Well, the most obvious thing was that when a voice was actually creaky, people heard it as creaky. That sounds simple, but it confirms that people can indeed identify creakiness. But here is where it gets interesting. They found that lower pitches, or lower F0s, also made voices sound creakier. Even if the voice wasn't actually creaky, so pitch definitely plays a role in how we perceive this voice quality. This aligns with the idea that pitch is a big clue for our ears when it comes to creakiness. Now, what about the faces? Here is a big surprise. The study found that seeing a man's face or a woman's face didn't, on its own, change how creaky people heard the voice. So, the idea that just seeing a face automatically makes us hear creakiness differently seemed to be pretty weak. But there was a tiny twist. While the faces didn't matter alone, they did seem to interact a bit with the pitch. At lower pitches, hearing a female face made people rate the voice as slightly creakier. But at higher pitches, a male face seemed to nudge the ratings a little bit higher. This is like a subtle hint of what we might expect. Maybe we associate different pitches with different genders, and when those expectations are met or not met, it subtly shifts our perception. This is what they call a gender prototypicality bias. It is not a strong effect, but it suggests our brains are always trying to match what we hear with what we expect based on social cues. So, what is the big takeaway from all this? The researchers conclude that neither a simple acoustic bias like pitch nor a simple gender bias, like seeing a face by itself, can explain why people have been reporting women using more creaky voice. It is not as straightforward as women use creaky voice because of X reason. The paper discusses a few reasons for this discrepancy. One is that maybe our understanding of what sounds creaky is complicated. It is possible that when we see a face and hear a voice that don't quite match our expectations, for example, a low voice with a female face, or a higher voice with a male face, we might be rating more than just creakiness. We might be rating how weird or unusual the combination sounds. And that might get lumped into our creakiness ratings. This is where the study acknowledges that what we're rating might be increased weirdness to listeners, rather than pure creakiness. Another really important point is about how researchers have studied creaky voice in the past. The paper highlights that many recent sociolinguistic studies that found women use more creaky voice relied on impressionistic coding, which is basically listening and judgment without very precise acoustic measurement. The authors suggest that these methods might not be as reliable as we think, especially when they aren't backed up by objective acoustic data or controlled perception experiments. This is a critical look at how we've been studying this sound. Ultimately, this research tells us that our perception of voice is not just about the raw sounds. It is a complex mix of acoustics, like pitch, and social information. Like what we expect from different genders. The study is pushing for a more nuanced way of thinking about voice perception, one that considers how our brains blend everything together. So, to wrap it up, this study found that yes, pitch matters a lot for how we hear creakiness, with lower pitches generally sounding creakier. And while seeing a face didn't directly change our ratings, there were hints that it interacted with pitch in subtle ways, perhaps reflecting our gender expectations, but critically, it strongly suggests that the idea of women universally using more creaky voice and that this is due to a simple gender bias is likely an oversimplification. The consistent finding across multiple controlled studies now is that the idea that women are just naturally creakier or that we're biased to hear them that way doesn't hold up under close scientific scrutiny. This really challenges the popular narrative and some recent research that has relied on less controlled methods. It is a call for more rigorous research when we talk about how social factors influence sound perception. My take on this is that it is a really important step in understanding how we make judgments about voices. The fact that they control for so many variables like pitch and form and structure, and still found that simple face gender bias wasn't a strong factor, is a big deal. It shows we need to be really careful about how we interpret subjective judgments like impressionistic coding. The study acknowledges its own limitations, like the potential for unnatural-sounding stimuli and the need to explore Canadian English listeners' specific biases more deeply. It makes you wonder if impressionistic coding isn't as reliable as we thought. How many past conclusions about language variation might need re-examination? The authors suggest that future research should really dig into how these complex interactions between acoustic cues and social expectations work. Perhaps looking at how different audiences react, or how the context of the speech plays a role. It opens up a whole new avenue for studying the intricate relationship between what we hear and what we expect. So, what do you all think? Have you noticed yourself making judgments about voices based on pitch or gender? Let me know in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Thanks for watching.